Hello, everyone. I am the Sleeper Man, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. What if I told you there's something out there in the woods you can't explain, and I saw it up close? This story will take you deep into the isolation of Camp Tommy, where I had a disturbing encounter with a creature like nothing else. If you've ever felt like you weren't alone out there, you'll want to hear what happened when it got too close. Stay until the end to find out why I've never gone back. I had no business being out that night, not in those woods, not after midnight. But when you're 21 and working as a camp counselor, rules don't seem to hold much weight, especially when there's a girl waiting for you in another cabin. It was a routine I'd gotten used to sneaking out after curfew, slipping through the trees to avoid being seen. Camp Tommy, Fishkill, New York was practically a maze of thick woods, winding trails, and the kind of isolation that made you feel like you were the only person on the planet. The place was eerie at night, though. There's something about the way the wind moves through the trees, the way the darkness swallows everything whole. That night, as I made my way through the woods, the air felt heavier than usual, the kind of thick, suffocating silence that always precedes a storm. I thought nothing of it at first, focusing on reaching our cabin. But as I cut through the narrow path, I heard the distinct rustling in the bushes. I froze. There were bears and other wildlife out here, and I'd heard stories about campers encountering them on trails. My heart raced as I scanned the area, squinting into the blackness. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. Then something stepped out from the bushes, a figure, no more than 3 feet tall, standing on 2 legs like a person. But it wasn't a person, at least not like any I'd ever seen. The creature was solid black, as though it absorbed every bit of light around it. No features, no clothes, just this dark human-like figure staring at me. For a split second I wondered if I was seeing things, if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after days of hiking and sleep deprivation. But it was real. I took a cautious step forward, trying to get a better look, when suddenly it bolted, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It moved in a way that made no sense, like its body shifted in a mechanical, jerky motion before it disappeared into the woods. I didn't chase it. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. It was too small to be human, too fast to be any animal I knew. I stood there for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat, as the night seemed to press in around me. Horror stories, true stories, I'd heard them all from campers, but nothing compared to the fear that gripped me in that moment. Sleep horror? It was real. I wasn't dreaming. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the blackness where the thing had disappeared. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone, refusing to move as my mind raced to figure out what had just happened. My first thought was to head back to my cabin and pretend none of it was real. Maybe I was tired, or the shadows were playing tricks on me, but I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't shake how real it had felt, how unnatural that thing had moved. It wasn't just some animal. Eventually, my body kicked back into gear and I started walking again. But now, every little sound around me made my skin crawl. The wind rustling the leaves, the snapping of twigs under my feet, it all sounded louder, sharper, like the woods were alive and watching. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, but it didn't help. There was a strange tension in the air, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. As I approached the edge of the trail that led to her cabin, I heard it again. This time, the rustling came from behind me. My stomach dropped, and I turned slowly, scanning the dark. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I felt my heart pounding in my chest so loud it was all I could hear. I forced myself to keep moving, picking up the pace. My mind was spinning with thoughts of what that thing could have been. An animal? No, it had to be something else, something I didn't want to think about. I finally reached the cabin, my hand trembling as I knocked softly on the door. When she answered, I must have looked pale, because she immediately asked if I was okay. I tried to play it off, brushing it aside as just nerves or the woods getting to me, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We sat down in the dimly lit cabin, the rain starting to tap softly on the roof. The sound was usually soothing, almost like a sleep aid after a long day. But tonight it only added to the unease settling in my gut. As we talked, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure, the way it had turned and run, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I tried to focus on the conversation, on her voice, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods. I felt like I was being pulled back, like something was waiting for me out there. I didn't want to go back. Not yet, but I knew I'd have to eventually. I spent the next hour trying to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a heavy fog. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, my mind kept wandering back to the dark trail and that strange creature. I didn't tell her about it. Something in me wanted to keep it quiet, like saying it out loud would make it more real. But I was already restless, checking the window every few minutes as if expecting to see something lurking outside. The rain was coming down harder now, a constant drumming on the cabin roof that made everything feel even more claustrophobic. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and told her I needed to go, brushing off her concern with a lame excuse about an early morning. The truth was, I felt like I was being drawn back out there like something was unfinished. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but it was as if the woods themselves were calling me, daring me to come back. I didn't want to, but the curiosity was too strong, even if part of me was terrified of what I might find. The rain had turned the trail into a muddy mess, and each step felt heavier, like the ground was trying to pull me under. The wind picked up, carrying with it an eerie whistle that cut through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I looked back, there was nothing but darkness and rain. It was as if the world beyond my flashlight's beam didn't exist, swallowed up by the woods. Horror stories flashed through my mind, those true stories people tell around campfires to scare each other. But this wasn't some bedtime story. This was happening. Then, just as I was nearing the spot where I'd first seen the thing, I heard it again. That same rustling, but this time it was closer, more deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I thought about running back to the cabin, locking myself inside, and pretending none of this had happened, but something held me in place. A mix of fear and fascination. I wanted to see it again, to understand what it was, so I stood there, staring into the woods, waiting for it to make its move. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the same small, humanoid figure standing just beyond the trees. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. I could see it more clearly now, but the details were still impossible to make out. It was like a shadow that had taken on form, a solid black shape with no features, no face, just there, standing in the rain watching me. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't alone. There were two of them now, standing side by side, their shapes barely distinguishable in the darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting brief, unreliable glimpses of their forms. The rain seemed to intensify, almost as if the storm was feeding off the fear crawling through my veins. My hands tightened around the flashlight, knuckles white with tension. Every logical part of me screamed to turn back, to get out of there before whatever these things were decided to come closer. But something kept me rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of horror and the desperate need for answers. One of them moved, a sudden jerk, almost robotic, like the last time. It shifted its entire body at an unnatural angle, then took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Its movements were wrong, there's no other way to describe it. It was as if every joint and muscle was out of sync, bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. The other one remained perfectly still, almost blending into the background as though it was waiting for something. I could feel the rain pouring down my back, cold and unforgiving, but my attention stayed locked on those figures, frozen in their eerie choreography. I finally broke. The rational part of my brain took over and I turned on my heel, sprinting back down the muddy trail as fast as I could. My boots slipped in the muck, and the rain made it impossible to see where I was going, but I didn't care. My only goal was to get away from whatever those things were. The sound of my own breathing mixed with the patter of rain, a frantic symphony of panic as I ran. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, just the rain and the sound of the wind whipping through the trees. No chase, no pursuit, When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed against the door, struggling to catch my breath. For a few minutes, I just stood there, drenched and shaking, trying to convince myself that I hadn't gone completely mad. But I knew what I'd seen, there was no denying it. I didn't even bother explaining anything to her when I got inside. I just locked the door, pulled the curtains closed, and sat down, my body trembling from the cold and adrenaline. We didn't talk about it. How could we? Some things just can't be explained. I never went back out to those woods after that night. I couldn't. Every time I even thought about it, a deep, unsettling fear rose up inside me like a warning. There are places in this world where the unknown lingers just out of sight, waiting for the curious and the brave. I wasn't brave anymore. I never found out what those things were, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that the woods are still there, silent and dark, keeping their secrets. And maybe somewhere out there those figures are still watching, waiting for their next visitor. Can you imagine hiking through the woods and stumbling upon something that defies all logic? This video will dive into the horrifying true story of our backpacking trip, where we faced inexplicable terror and mysterious figures. Don't miss out on the spine-chilling details of what we found and why it left us questioning reality. Backpacking trips were a tradition among us. We weren't professionals, but between the four of us we had enough outdoor experience to navigate the deep woods without getting lost. The group was simple, one friend who worked as a ranger, and the rest of us bio and botany nerds with a love for nature and camping. Our route through the forest wasn't too far from civilization, but far enough to avoid casual hikers. We loved it that way. Quiet, peaceful, and isolated. Day one was uneventful. We climbed more elevation than usual, and by the time we reached our camp spot, the sun was setting. The sky was so clear, it felt like I could reach out and touch the stars. We spent the night around the campfire, cooking beans and rice, swapping funny stories, and soaking in the tranquility of nature. The rain sounds from the previous night's drizzle had left the air fresh and cool. There's something about the woods that lulls you into a sense of safety, like nothing could ever go wrong under the stars. But that feeling never lasts, especially in the deep woods. Day two started normally, but something was off as dusk approached. We all woke up abruptly to a piercing scream, the kind that makes your heart leap into your throat. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife in distress, especially coyotes or foxes, but this sound was different. It had a guttural edge, something primal and terrifying. We all sat up, wide-eyed, and exchanged glances. The forest was dead silent afterward, no rustling, no wind, no life. We figured something had met a bloody end nearby, but we couldn't just sit around. We grabbed our flashlights and started a perimeter check around the camp. What we found wasn't just odd, it was horrifying. There, in the clearing not far from our tents, was a pile of flesh and fur, mangled and shredded like it had been through a meat grinder. It looked like someone had exploded an animal from the inside out. I tried to make sense of it, but there was no pattern, no logical explanation. One of us muttered something about a coyote or maybe a bear, but deep down, none of us believed that. After debating for a while, we decided to chalk it up to a predator's frenzy and went back to camp. We laughed it off. But the truth was, none of us felt at ease. Something about that pile of gore didn't sit right. It wasn't just the sight of it, but the feeling, the unsettling vibe that creeps up your spine when you know something is wrong. We pretended it was nothing, but we all felt it. The rain sounds from earlier that day had faded, and the forest felt empty, too empty. The rest of that day was quiet, almost too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, as we gathered around the fire, the usual banter faded, replaced by awkward silences. We were all on edge, though no one wanted to admit it. I remember staring into the flames, half expecting to hear that scream again. But it never came. The third day started with an eerie calm. We were all a bit rattled after what we saw the previous night, but no one wanted to acknowledge it. We packed up camp, cracked a few weak jokes, and moved forward like nothing had happened. But something was hanging in the air, an unspoken dread that followed us as we hiked deeper into the woods. The further we went, the thicker the silence became. It was as if the forest itself was waiting for something. We arrived at our next campsite earlier than usual, eager to get off our feet after 2 grueling days of hiking. The site was surrounded by towering trees, with a small clearing that opened up to the sky. We figured it would be a perfect place to unwind, maybe even forget about the horror from the night before. The ranger, always practical, set up his tent near the biggest tree. We gathered wood, lit a fire, and passed around a bottle of whiskey, hoping to lighten the mood. It wasn't long before the forest reminded us that we weren't alone. As the sun dipped below the tree line, we were sitting around the fire, lost in conversation. One of my friends had just started a story about his ex when there was a loud snap from somewhere behind us. We all jumped, eyes scanning the tree line. It sounded like a tree breaking under pressure, a sound any seasoned camper would recognize, but we couldn't see anything. We stood still, waiting for another noise, but after a few moments, the forest returned to its eerie quiet. Just as we were beginning to relax, the scream echoed through the woods again. This time it was distant, but still gut-wrenching. The ranger was the first to react, standing up with his flashlight, scanning the area. "That didn't sound like an animal," he said, his voice steady but unnerved. It was the same kind of shrill wail we'd heard on day 2, except this time it seemed to echo, as if coming from some unseen cave. We decided to investigate against our better judgment. We split into pairs and started walking toward the sound, flashlights sweeping the forest floor. It took us about 30 minutes before one of us called out, claiming they saw something in the trees. "Did you see that?" came the whisper, sharp and quick. We all stopped in our tracks, squinting into the darkness. There, just beyond the camp, something moved, a shadow, a figure. For a brief moment, it looked like a person standing among the trees, but then it was gone. We all froze, unsure of what we had just seen. "It was right there," my friend said, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand was shaking, pointing toward the brush where the shadow had disappeared. The forest, once again, fell silent. We waited for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably just minutes. There was no wind, no rustling, no sounds, just the overwhelming weight of silence pressing down on us. The ranger took a few steps forward, gripping his rifle tighter. "Let's get back to camp," he muttered. No one argued. As we turned to head back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I followed the others, my flashlight flickering in the dying light. We didn't say much as we made our way back to the fire, but we all felt it, the sense that whatever had been out there was still close. Too close for comfort. Back at camp, the mood was somber. We were all visibly shaken, trying to piece together what we had seen and heard. The sun was setting, and the first hints of twilight began to creep across the clearing. We set up our lanterns, hoping that the light would push away the creeping darkness and our growing anxiety. The forest, however, seemed to embrace the encroaching night, deepening the shadows around us. As we tried to settle back into our routine, one of us, clearly unnerved, suggested we make some noise to ward off whatever might be lurking in the trees. We started shouting into the darkness, our voices echoing oddly against the dense foliage. The ranger insisted it was just a bear or a wild animal, though his attempt to sound confident was betrayed by his darting eyes and the tight grip on his rifle. Just as we were about to give up and return to our camp, another chilling wail pierced the night. This one was closer than before, echoing off the trees in a way that made it sound like it was coming from inside a cave. We had heard that same wail twice already, and with each repetition, the sound seemed to grow more unsettling. It was clear that whatever was making the noise wasn't just passing through it, was purposefully moving with us. We decided to investigate the source of the wail, hoping to get to the bottom of this disturbing phenomenon. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the tangled underbrush and the occasional shifting shadow. After another 45 minutes of fruitless searching, we were about to call it a night when one of us spotted movement across the clearing. "Did you see that?" came the urgent whisper. A figure emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing, moving in a deliberate manner that looked oddly human yet disjointed. It was tall and lean, its form partially obscured by the undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest as we all watched, frozen in place. The figure seemed to be moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, its steps deliberate and calculated. The ranger, sensing the danger, whispered for us to stay hidden. We crouched behind the trees, trying to get a better look at the figure as it moved from one spot to another, seemingly circling our camp. As it approached a large boulder near the edge of the clearing, it suddenly stopped and knelt down. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something that looked like an old, tattered piece of fabric draped over a rock, but it was gone before I could fully process it. Suddenly, the figure straightened and turned toward us. We all held our breath, trying to remain as still as possible. The figure's outline was visible against the background of the trees, but its details remained shrouded in darkness. The tension was palpable, each of us waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, the figure bolted into the trees with a speed that defied explanation. It wasn't a run. It was more like a blur, moving impossibly fast through the forest. We waited in silence for what felt like hours, our nerves frayed and our minds racing. Finally, we decided to head back to camp and reassess. As we walked back, we found another mound of flesh, much like the one we had seen before, only this time mixed with unmistakable fox paws. It was a horrifying sight, a grim reminder that whatever we were dealing with was not only real but dangerously close. We huddled around the fire that night, our nerves shot and sleep elusive. The rain sounds, once soothing, now seemed to add to the sense of unease. Every crack of a twig, every distant rustle of leaves had us jumping at shadows. We tried to laugh it off, making jokes about mythical creatures and ghost stories, but the fear was palpable. None of us could shake the feeling that we were being hunted, tracked by something that defied all logic and reason. The fourth day dawned with an overcast sky and a chill in the air. We were exhausted, barely managing to get any rest the previous night. The unsettling experiences of the past 2 nights had taken their toll, and we were all eager to get out of the woods. As we packed up camp, our mood was heavy, each of us silently hoping for a peaceful end to this ordeal. The forest seemed quieter than usual as we began our trek back to the trailhead. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were subdued, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We moved quickly, trying to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Around midday, we stopped for a break, huddling around a makeshift campfire. The ranger, who had been relatively calm throughout this ordeal, seemed more tense than usual. "We should have been out of here by now," he said, glancing at his watch. "Something's off." We all felt it, the same oppressive feeling that had been hanging over us since day 2. As we resumed our hike, the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The shadows were deeper, more pronounced, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate through. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, a feeling that something was about to happen. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows that twisted and danced among the trees. We were just a few miles from the trailhead when the silence was broken by a familiar, chilling wail. It was unmistakable, the same eerie cry that had haunted us throughout our trip. We stopped in our tracks, scanning the forest for the source of the sound. It was closer than before, and it seemed to be following us, moving in tandem with our progress. We quickened our pace, the sound growing louder and more persistent. The ranger led the way, his rifle at the ready. We could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, a reminder that whatever was following us was still close. Every few minutes, we would hear that wail again, always just behind us, always just out of sight. As darkness began to envelop the forest, we finally saw the faint outline of the trailhead in the distance. We pushed ourselves harder, driven by the need to escape. The wail grew louder, more insistent, as if urging us to move faster. We reached the trailhead just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, and the forest was plunged into darkness. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We packed our gear into the car and drove away as quickly as we could. The forest seemed to recede behind us, but the memory of the past few days lingered. We didn't speak much on the drive home, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of the inexplicable events we had just experienced. To this day, none of us can fully explain what happened in those woods. The wails, the mysterious figure, the horrifying mounds of flesh, everything remains a haunting mystery. We often talk about it, sharing our memories and trying to piece together what really happened, but in the end, It's clear that whatever we encountered was beyond our understanding. All we know for sure is that we were followed by something we couldn't see, something that made its presence known in the most unsettling ways. The experience has left us with more questions than answers, and a deep respect for the unknown. And as we share our stories, we remember that the woods, though beautiful, can also be a place of unimaginable horror. What if I told you that a late-night adventure in the woods turned into a terrifying experience that you need to hear to believe? Follow us as we recount the night we heard an eerie voice and faced a nosebleed that seemed too coincidental to ignore. Missing this video means missing out on a true horror story that reveals the spine-chilling reality of what can happen when you venture off the beaten path. Find out what happened next and why you'll be glued to your screen. I had been looking forward to our camping trip to Suwannee River Music Park for months. The thought of getting away from everything and spending some time in the heart of Florida's wilderness was a welcome change. By 11:00 p.m., the park had taken on a new, almost eerie quality. The lights from the festival had long faded, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the river and the rain sounds that seemed to seep through the thick canopy above. My sister and I decided to take advantage of the quiet and explore a nearby trail we hadn't noticed before. It was an impulse decision, driven by curiosity and a sense of adventure. We followed the main trail, which led us to an entrance marked by yellow tape strung between two trees. The tape fluttered slightly in the wind, almost as if warning us to turn back. But, drawn by the allure of the unknown, we pushed through the tape and stepped onto the path. The deeper we went, the more the trail seemed to close in around us. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with each gust of wind. About 15 steps in, a voice cut through the silence. It was unmistakably our mother's voice, clear as day, asking, "Honey, why is your nose bleeding?" My heart sank. Our mother wasn't with us. She was back home. I looked at my sister, her face pale as she turned to look at me. The voice had been so real, so immediate, that it felt like a cruel trick of the night. We both started to turn back toward the main trail, our footsteps quickening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. Was it just the rain sounds playing tricks on us? Or was it something else entirely? A few minutes later, as we emerged from the trail, my sister suddenly clutched her face. Her nose was bleeding, and it only lasted for about 20 seconds. It was a jarring, surreal moment, one that left us both shaken. The bleeding stopped as abruptly as it started, but the memory of that voice lingered, mingling with the rain sounds and the oppressive darkness of the woods. We hurried back to our campsite, my sister's quiet sniffles and the steady rhythm of our footsteps the only sounds breaking the night stillness. The rain had picked up, creating a constant drumming sound on the leaves overhead. The campfire's glow felt reassuring as we emerged from the woods, but the warmth didn't entirely chase away the unease that clung to us. Once we were back among the other campers, we tried to shake off the incident. Everyone else seemed engrossed in their own conversations and laughter, oblivious to the unsettling experience we had just had. We sat by the fire, pretending to be relaxed, while our minds replayed the voice and the strange timing of my sister's nosebleed. Every now and then I glanced toward the dark edge of the woods where the trail was. It was almost as if the trees were silently watching us, though I knew it was just the shadows playing tricks. Despite our attempts to ignore it, the incident cast a long shadow over the rest of the night. My sister and I exchanged uneasy glances, both too unsettled to talk about what had happened. As the hours dragged on, the campfire's warmth became a mere comfort against the growing chill of the night. We tried to distract ourselves with stories and laughter, but the memory of the voice and the nosebleed were never far from our thoughts. Every crack of the fire and every gust of wind seemed amplified, each one adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Eventually, we decided to head to our tents. As we crawled into our sleeping bags, the sounds of the forest outside seemed louder than before, more pronounced. The rain's steady rhythm became a haunting backdrop to our restless thoughts. Sleep was elusive, each small sound a potential reminder of the unsettling voice we had heard. The night felt endless, a stark contrast to the adventure we had hoped for. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. I must have dozed off for a brief period, only to wake with a start. The rain had intensified, hammering on the tent with a relentless rhythm that was both soothing and unnerving. I tried to convince myself that it was just the weather, that the forest wasn't hiding any more secrets from us, but the fear from earlier clung to me, refusing to let go. Around 3:00 a.m., I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the rain or the wind, but a distinct, soft whispering. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering seemed to come from outside the tent, mingling with the natural sounds of the night. I poked my head out of the sleeping bag, listening intently. My sister, thankfully, was still asleep, her breathing steady and calm. I quietly unzipped the tent and peered into the darkness. The rain had created small pools of water around the campsite, and the trees were heavy with moisture. The forest was eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the constant sound of rain. I stepped outside, my boots squelching in the wet ground. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves amplified in the stillness. The trail we had explored earlier was a dark, impenetrable line against the gloom. It seemed to loom over the campsite, as if daring me to return. I stood there for a few minutes, my mind racing through what we had experienced. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as a trick of the rain or fatigue, but the unsettling feeling persisted, gnawing at my nerves. Just as I was about to retreat back into the tent, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, on the edge of the trail, was a small, dark shape. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was moving slowly, almost as if it was deliberately avoiding detection. I quickly stepped back into the tent, my heart pounding. I tried to ignore the image, but it stayed with me as I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The first light of dawn crept into the tent, casting a grayish hue over everything. I woke up feeling both exhausted and on edge. My sister was already stirring, rubbing her eyes and yawning. The events of the previous night felt like a heavy weight on my shoulders, and I could tell she was still affected by the unsettling experience as well. As we emerged from the tent, the campsite looked almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the fear that had gripped us. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a mist that clung to the trees and ground. Everything was wet and glistening, but the morning light had a calming effect, making the night's events seem almost like a bad dream. We tried to act normal, but the shadows of the previous night still loomed large in our minds. I felt a strange compulsion to return to the trail, to see if anything had changed, or if there was something we had missed. My sister, though still wary, agreed to come with me. We walked back to the spot where we had seen the dark shape, the air filled with the fresh scent of wet earth and foliage. As we approached, the trail seemed different, more subdued, as if it was holding its breath. We carefully made our way down the path, every step crunching softly on the wet leaves. The area where we had heard the voice was now just an ordinary part of the woods, devoid of any hint of the previous night's strangeness. We didn't find anything out of the ordinary, no sign of what we had seen or heard. The only thing that remained was the yellow tape, still fluttering gently between the trees. As we headed back to the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the woods. Whether it was the psychological impact of our experience or something more, I couldn't be sure. We packed up our things and left Suwannee River Music Park with a sense of relief mixed with lingering unease. The camping trip, meant to be a relaxing escape, had turned into a chilling episode of true horror stories. Driving away, I glanced back at the forest one last time, wondering if it held any more secrets, or if it was simply our minds playing tricks on us. The experience had left an indelible mark, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can be turned upside down by the unknown. And with that, we left behind our nighttime horror and returned to the familiar world, forever changed by the chilling tales of the deep woods. Ever wished you could avoid the unsettling surprises of a camping trip gone wrong? Watch as I uncover the eerie details of a night in the woods when an unknown entity pressed against our tent, leaving us puzzled and on edge. Don't miss out on discovering why this bizarre experience is more than just a strange occurrence, and what you can learn from it. The first night of our camping trip in Colorado was supposed to be a straightforward adventure. We had chosen a spot deep in the woods, away from the usual trail, for a bit of solitude. It was the kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of distant wildlife. My friends and I set up our tent, a snug little thing that barely fit the three of us. With our sleeping bags packed tight, we settled in for the night. As the evening settled, the rain began to fall softly, creating a soothing rhythm on the tent. The sound was oddly calming, like a gentle lullaby meant to ease us into sleep. We joked around about how we were living the horror stories we love to read, though none of us really expected anything out of the ordinary. The rain was just a backdrop to our normal night under the stars. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, something felt off. I was nestled in my sleeping bag, but I felt warm bodies pressed against both sides of me. I was initially groggy and thought I had somehow rolled over into the middle, but when I opened my eyes, the tent wall was still in place on my side. I was distinctly aware that there was something else against the fabric, something on the outside. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was next to me was not just my friends. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. I tried to wake my friends, my voice coming out in a whispering panic. As I leaned over, I felt the warm pressure against my side shift abruptly. It was as if whatever it was had decided to move away quickly. My friends stirred groggily but didn't fully wake up. I waited in tense silence, listening to the rain sounds and trying to make sense of what had happened. The pressure against the tent was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. There was no clear explanation for why an animal, or anything for that matter, would choose to bed down so close to us. The idea of a wild creature seeking comfort in the middle of the night seemed almost absurd. The next morning brought no comfort. As the first light of dawn seeped through the tent, I was eager to put the previous night's unsettling encounter behind us. We emerged from our tent, each of us a little bleary-eyed but hopeful that the daylight would erase the previous night's oddities. The forest around us was beautiful in the morning light, with dew clinging to the leaves and the air crisp and clean. We went about our routine, cooking breakfast and chatting about the night. I could tell my friends sensed something was off, but they brushed it aside with casual jokes about sleeping with the wildlife. I couldn't shake the feeling of being unsettled, and I couldn't help but feel that I was missing something obvious. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, as if the night had left a mark on my nerves. After breakfast, we decided to explore the area a bit. We walked along a narrow trail that wound through the dense woods. As we made our way deeper into the forest, I tried to focus on the natural beauty around us. The forest was serene, almost unnaturally so, and I wondered if the stillness was a result of the rain, or if something else was at play. The trail was relatively undisturbed, with no signs of recent animal activity. Our hike took us in a large loop, and by mid-afternoon we were back at the campsite. Despite the pleasant distraction of the hike, I couldn't shake the memory of the previous night. The feeling of warmth against me, the sense of something or someone resting so close, was too vivid to forget. I began to second-guess myself, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing or if my mind had played tricks on me. As dusk approached, the rain returned, this time more persistent. We settled back into the tent, each of us more subdued than the night before. The rain sounds grew louder, creating a rhythmic backdrop that felt oddly oppressive. I lay awake, staring at the tent's ceiling, trying to ignore the quiet thud of raindrops and a creeping sense of dread. Morning came slowly, the rain having finally stopped, leaving behind a misty chill. We emerged from the tent, stretching and trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. My friends and I laughed off the night's events, attributing it to our imagination or perhaps an overactive fear of the dark. Still, a sense of unease lingered in the air, just beneath the surface of our casual conversation. As we went about our morning routine, I couldn't shake the memory of that warm pressure against my side. I decided to check the area around our campsite for any signs of what might have been there. I carefully stepped into the damp grass, scanning the ground for tracks or any unusual disturbances. The woods around us were eerily quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the trees and the distant call of birds. To my surprise, there were no obvious signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no disturbed underbrush, just the usual forest floor covered in leaves and rain-soaked earth. I circled the perimeter of our campsite, looking for anything that might explain the sensation I had felt. It was unsettling to find nothing, as if the entire incident had been a figment of my imagination. My friends joined me in the search, though they were more interested in finding a good spot for breakfast than in investigating what might have happened. Their lack of concern only heightened my own sense of confusion and worry. I knew what I had felt, and the lack of evidence only made it more difficult to rationalize. After breakfast, we decided to explore the nearby trails, hoping that a change of scenery would help clear our heads. The forest, while beautiful, felt different that day. The sense of normalcy had been replaced by a subtle tension that I couldn't quite place. We walked in silence for a while, the earlier joviality replaced by an unspoken understanding that something wasn't right. By mid-afternoon, the forest had grown darker as clouds gathered once more. The rain had ceased, but the heavy, overcast sky cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around us. Despite the clear, sunny start to the day, the atmosphere had shifted, and an oppressive quiet hung over the woods. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We stumbled upon a small clearing, a perfect spot for a break. We sat down, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. Conversations were stilted, and every small noise, a snapping twig, a rustle in the leaves, seemed amplified. I glanced around frequently, half expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees. As the hours passed, the anxiety in me built up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There was no concrete evidence to suggest any threat, but the sense of something being amiss was unmistakable. My friends tried to joke around to lighten the mood, but their laughter felt hollow and forced. Around dusk, we decided to head back to our campsite. The temperature dropped quickly as evening approached, and the light started to fade. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now seemed vast and alien. The sounds of the forest seemed different, more menacing. The gentle rustle of leaves took on a sharper edge, and every shadow seemed to harbor secrets. Back at the campsite, we began preparing for dinner in relative silence. The tension was palpable, and our earlier camaraderie had evaporated. Each of us was lost in our thoughts, and the eerie calm of the nightfall only seemed to amplify our unease. We huddled around the small campfire, trying to shake off the discomfort, but it clung to us stubbornly. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. We tried to focus on the comforting warmth of the flames and the familiarity of roasting marshmallows, yet the earlier incident still hung heavy in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to wrap itself around us like the chill of the night. As darkness settled in, the forest around us grew eerily silent. The sounds that usually accompanied the night crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, were conspicuously absent. We went to bed early, hoping that sleep would offer some respite from the unsettling day. Inside the tent, we arranged ourselves as before, though the closeness felt more stifling than comforting. The rain had started again, and the rhythmic patter on the tent was now a constant backdrop to our restless shifting. I lay awake, my thoughts racing, replaying the events of the previous night. The sensation of warmth against my side, the sudden absence of whatever had been there, everything was as fresh in my mind as if it had just happened. At some point during the night, I heard a slight rustling outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise stopped, then started again, this time closer to the tent. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake my friends. The rain sounds outside seemed to amplify every tiny noise, making it difficult to determine what was causing the disturbance. I mustered the courage to peek outside, but the darkness and the thick rain made it impossible to see anything clearly. I sat back down, feeling the fear settle in my chest. The noise continued intermittently, as though something was moving around the tent, but it never got close enough to clearly identify. The entire experience felt surreal, a blend of anxiety and curiosity that kept me on edge. The rest of the night passed in a restless blur. When morning finally came, I was relieved but exhausted. The unsettling events of the night before left us all subdued. We packed up our campsite, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The camaraderie of the trip overshadowed by the night's experiences. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, the deep woods now holding a secret I couldn't quite understand but knew would remain with me long after our trip had ended. Ever wondered what it's like to be completely alone on a remote island, only to discover something terrifying? This video dives into a park ranger's harrowing night in the deep woods where he encounters a mysterious figure. You'll hear how a simple hike turned into a nightmare, and why you won't want to miss the spine-chilling details of his discovery. Stay tuned to find out what he uncovered in the darkness. I was the sole park ranger on a small island, accessible only by private boat. During the summer, the island bustled with tourists, but come winter, it became a ghost town. I thrived on the solitude, savoring the 400 acres of wilderness all to myself. No phone, no internet, just me and the island. Sometimes, though, the quiet grew stifling, and I sought adventure in the darkness. One of my favorite pastimes was to hike the island at night without a flashlight. The moonlight guided me, but there was always a stretch of the main trail that plunged me into complete darkness, surrounded by the island's oldest trees. One night, as I ventured into this ancient forest, I heard something behind me. I whipped around, seeing nothing. When I turned back, a branch brushed my face. My heart leaped into my throat as I instinctively swung my fist at it. I bolted through the forest, my heavy boots thudding against the ground, my gun belt bouncing wildly. I laughed nervously when I finally stopped, winded and with a stitch in my side. I examined my hand, feeling the sting of a cut from the branch. Through the spread fingers of my injured hand, I spotted a bright white blur off the trail. I figured it was one of the island's elusive white-rumped deer, often mistaken for palominoses, but it darted up a side trail before I could get a closer look. Regaining my breath, I decided to investigate. I followed the trail for about 100 feet until it split. From the fork, I heard something moving through the underbrush. I crouched low, trying to stay quiet. The trail climbed as it neared the island's center, where the moonlight finally penetrated the dense canopy. A sharp bark froze me in place. I crept a few steps forward and strained my eyes to see ahead. Suddenly, a crunch behind me made me spin around. There, about 30 feet away, stood a tall, pale man with dark hair wearing a bright white t-shirt. His eyes gleamed with a wild grin as he let out a sharp, deranged "ha!" Before sprinting off into the woods, I stood frozen, my hand resting on my gun, scanning the trees. After a few tense moments of silence, I backed away from the fork and hurried back to the main trail. Terrified, I speed walked all the way to my cabin, my mind racing with questions. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the man's unsettling grin from my mind. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but fear gnawed at me. I knew I had to check the area again, even if it meant braving the night. Grabbing a flashlight, I set out to patrol the island's perimeter, looking for any sign of an intruder. The rain had started to fall. A steady drumming of rain sounds against the canopy. It added a layer of eeriness to the already unsettling night. As I made my way around the island, the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but I found nothing unusual. I checked every possible spot where someone might hide, every nook, cranny, and even the small shelters used by occasional campers. The island was as quiet as it ever was, save for the constant soothing rhythm of the rain. By morning, with the light of day breaking through the clouds, I continued my search. I combed through the area where I had seen the man, carefully examining the ground for any tracks or signs of disturbance. My boots sank into the wet earth as I walked, but nothing stood out. The trail was clear, except for the usual marks of wildlife. It was as if the night's events were a figment of my imagination. Despite my thorough investigation, I found no evidence of a visitor, no discarded items, no signs of a boat landing. The lack of clues only added to my unease. I knew the island well, and the man's ability to move off trail suggested he was familiar with it too. His sudden appearance and disappearance without leaving a trace felt deeply unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have known the island better than I did. As I returned to the cabin, I tried to focus on the normal routine of my day, but the image of the man and the eerie silence of the woods lingered in my mind. The island was my home, and the thought of someone lurking within it was both frightening and disorienting. I decided to keep a closer eye on things and remain vigilant, though I hoped I wouldn't encounter anything like that again. The next few days passed uneventfully, with the rain continuing to fall sporadically. I focused on my routine tasks and tried to dismiss the previous night's incident as a fluke. Yet, the thought of that man in the white t-shirt and his eerie grin haunted me, especially when I ventured out into the woods. One evening, feeling restless, I decided to take another nighttime hike, this time with a greater sense of caution. I wanted to retrace my steps from that unsettling night, hoping to uncover something I might have missed. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, leaving the forest shrouded in near complete darkness. I relied on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. As I approached the side trail where I had seen the man, I noticed something odd, a faint, irregular pattern in the underbrush. It was as if someone had recently moved through the dense foliage. I followed the trail carefully, trying to avoid making any noise. The rain had created a slippery surface, and I had to tread carefully to avoid making any sudden movements. The trail led me back to the fork where I had first encountered the man. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. I paused, listening intently for any sounds. There was nothing but the steady drip of rain and the occasional rustle of leaves. My flashlight's beam swept over the area, revealing nothing unusual. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I spun around, but the darkness revealed nothing. My heart raced, and I tried to steady my breathing. I scanned the area, but saw nothing out of place. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and the silence seemed almost oppressive. Deciding that it was best to cut my hike short, I made my way back to the cabin. The eerie feeling of being followed lingered, despite there being no visible evidence of anyone else around. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, and the thought of it left me feeling unsettled. The island was my refuge, and now it felt like a place of hidden threats. The following night I couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge. The island, usually a haven of tranquility, seemed different now. I decided to take another walk, this time with my flashlight and a renewed sense of caution. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground damp and the air crisp. I followed the same trail where I'd seen the man, hoping for some sort of explanation or sign. As I walked, every rustle in the underbrush and every snap of a twig seemed magnified. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, straining to hear any sound that might indicate someone else was nearby. My flashlight bobbed with each step, casting long, wavering shadows among the trees. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating a haunting play of light and dark on the forest floor. When I reached the fork in the trail where I had seen the man, I noticed something strange. The area seemed oddly untouched, as if no one had been there since my last visit. The sense of familiarity was unsettling, as if the forest was mocking me with its calm facade. I checked the underbrush and surrounding trees for any signs of disturbance, but found nothing out of place. My nerves were fraying. I moved slowly, methodically, hoping to find anything that would make sense of the bizarre encounter. The cold, damp air clung to me, adding to my discomfort. I felt a growing sense of paranoia, as if the forest itself was hiding secrets from me. After hours of searching, I returned to the cabin, exhausted. There was no sign of the man, no clues to his presence. The island's silence was almost oppressive, a stark contrast to the previous night's unsettling encounter. As I locked up for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew it was likely just my mind playing tricks on me. The days following my encounter with the man in the white shirt were filled with a lingering sense of unease. I kept a vigilant watch over the island, performing regular checks both day and night. The solitude, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a cage. The silence of the island was no longer comforting, but unnerving. One evening, after a few days of restless vigilance, I decided to hike to the top of the island's central hill. It provided a panoramic view of the surrounding area, and I hoped the elevated vantage point might offer some clarity. The sky was overcast, the air cool and damp from recent rain, and the world below looked hazy and distorted. As I stood there, scanning the island with a sense of foreboding, I spotted something unusual in the distance. Near the edge of the island, obscured by dense foliage, was a small makeshift structure, an old shelter of sorts. I hadn't seen it before, and its sudden appearance seemed both out of place and suspicious. I decided to investigate. Approaching the shelter cautiously, I realized it was a crude but functional hideaway. Inside, I found remnants of a small camp, a few personal items, some food wrappers, and a set of worn-out clothes. The sight of these belongings made it clear that someone had been living here for a while, possibly the same person I'd seen. The realization was chilling. The man was not just an intruder, but someone who had been hiding out on the island, possibly for an extended period. There were no clear signs of any recent activity, but the discovery added a new layer to the mystery. It seemed the man in the white shirt had a deeper connection to the island than I had initially thought. He knew the island well, which explained his sudden appearance and disappearance. The realization brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of vulnerability. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. The encounter and subsequent findings left me unsettled, with more questions than answers. I never saw the man again, but the knowledge that someone had been living on the island, hidden from view, remained a constant reminder of the unpredictable and often frightening reality of living alone in such a remote place. The island had returned to its quiet, empty state, but the echoes of that night lingered on, a reminder of the unsettling truth that sometimes the most frightening stories are true. Can you imagine spending a night on a haunted mesa and seeing eerie blue lights that defy explanation? This video reveals the true story behind the mysterious lights at Araca Mesa and uncovers why they were anything but supernatural. Stick around to discover the real reason behind these spooky phenomena and what it means for your understanding of horror stories. I'd always heard the tales about Araca Mesa. The stories around Philmont Scout Ranch told of mysterious lights and ghostly whispers, but I'd chalked them up to campfire exaggerations. After all, it's easy for legends to sprout in a place as rugged and isolated as this. But when I found myself on the backside of that very mesa one crisp evening, I realized that maybe there was something more to those narratives than I'd been willing to admit. That night, I was overseeing a scout troop camping at the base of Araca Mesa. The sky had just begun to darken after sunset, and the troop was in high spirits, chatting about the day's adventures. I hadn't shared any of the local ghost stories with them, figured it'd be more fun to let them discover any spookiness on their own, if it came to that. It was a clear night, and the stars began to pepper the sky, creating a beautiful backdrop for our camp. One of the scouts, a kid with a keen eye, pointed up toward the mesa. "What's that up there?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. I glanced up, thinking he must have spotted some flashlights or headlamps from another group. The terrain was familiar to me, and I knew there should be another camp in the vicinity, but as I looked closer, I realized the lights he was pointing at weren't coming from the trail as I'd expected. They seemed to be coming from behind the mesa, not from the well-trodden path. What made it even stranger was the color of the light. It wasn't the usual warm glow of a fire, but a cold, eerie blue. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a trick of the light or perhaps an optical illusion. 15 minutes later, the other group arrived in camp, their own flashlights bobbing along the trail. But even after they joined us, the blue lights continued to glow from the mesa's shadow. The sight was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I brushed it off as a combination of exhaustion and overactive imagination. Sleep that night was elusive. The unsettling glow from the mesa and the eerie quiet of the woods played tricks on my mind. And as if to compound the weirdness, a bear decided to visit our camp in the dead of night. I didn't hear it, but the evidence of its presence, mangled food wrappers and scattered gear, was impossible to ignore. The combination of the eerie lights and the nocturnal visitor made for one of the most unnerving nights I've ever spent. Morning arrived reluctantly, bringing little comfort to my restless night. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the remnants of a storm that had rolled through while we slept. The rain had left the ground sodden, and the usual sounds of the forest were muffled, creating a tense quiet that seemed to weigh on everyone. The scouts, clearly feeling the impact of the previous night's events, were quieter than usual as they packed up their gear. I tried to push away the unsettling feeling that lingered from the blue lights, It was easy to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. Maybe it was just an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, or perhaps the other campers had some sort of new light equipment. Still, the oddness of it all gnawed at the back of my mind. As we prepared to head out, I noticed one of the scouts staring intently at the mesa. His expression was a mix of awe and apprehension, and he muttered something about having seen the lights even brighter earlier. I nodded, not wanting to fuel any more speculation. We began our hike back to camp, trying to ignore the dampness and the persistent chill in the air. The trek back to the main camp was uneventful, but the eerie feeling didn't fade. Every rustle in the underbrush or snap of a twig seemed amplified in the dense silence. When we finally arrived, the main camp was bustling with activity. The other group's camp was still intact, with no sign of the strange blue lights. It was as if the phenomenon had vanished with the night, leaving no trace behind. I couldn't shake the thought that something about that night had been fundamentally different. As the day wore on, I kept an eye on the mesa, half expecting to see the blue lights reappear. But they didn't. The day turned into evening, and the strange occurrences from the previous night felt like a distant memory. Yet, despite the normalcy that had returned, I knew I'd never forget the sight of those eerie blue lights and the unsettling quiet they brought with them. Evening settled over the camp like a heavy blanket, and the scouts were eager to put the strange events of the previous night behind them. We gathered around the campfire, trying to create a sense of normalcy. I encouraged the scouts to share their favorite stories and sing songs, hoping to distract everyone from the lingering unease. As the fire crackled and the warmth from the flames began to push back against the cold night air, I couldn't help but glance over at Urraca Mesa. The silhouette of the mesa stood dark and imposing against the twilight, but tonight, the blue lights were conspicuously absent. It almost felt like a temporary reprieve, as if the mesa was waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets again. The scouts went to bed early, their exhaustion from the day catching up with them. I stayed up a little longer, keeping watch. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the forest unusually quiet. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, were muted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, a faint sound disturbed the silence. It was subtle, like distant footsteps, or perhaps the movement of something through the underbrush. My heart quickened, and I stood up to investigate, but the sound faded as soon as I moved. I scanned the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't want to wake the scouts, so I dismissed it as my imagination or perhaps a lingering echo from the storm. The rest of the night was spent in uneasy slumber. When morning arrived, I was relieved to see the sun rising over the mesa. The blue lights had not reappeared, and the day promised to be clear and calm. Yet, the strange events of the previous night still clung to my thoughts. I felt a creeping sense that whatever had happened was not quite over, that the mesa had more to reveal. As I prepared to move the troop out of the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just scratching the surface of something much deeper and more unsettling. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the camp began to buzz with activity. The scouts were eager to return to their usual routines, and I was relieved to see the group's spirits high despite the previous night's oddities. We packed up our gear, the morning's bright light casting a reassuring glow over everything. However, the mystery of the blue light still loomed large in my mind. I decided to make one final trip up to the base of Urraca Mesa before we departed. I needed to see if there was any logical explanation for what we had seen. The troop followed behind, their chatter a welcome distraction from the lingering sense of unease. When we reached the base of the mesa, I began to explore the area more thoroughly. The previous night's eerie blue lights had seemed to come from the mesa's shadow, so I focused my search on that area. As I moved around, I came across a small but significant discovery. A few pieces of broken glass and metal fragments. They looked like remnants from a small discarded camping lantern. It seemed that the lights we had seen might have been the result of a malfunctioning or improperly shielded light source. I carefully examined the area, trying to piece together what might have happened. It became clear that there had been some kind of camping equipment left behind by a previous group, possibly the very group that had arrived in our camp after the strange lights. The blue hue could have been caused by the lantern's filter or an unusual light source, which was further exaggerated by the mesa's topography. By the time we returned to the main camp, I felt a sense of relief mixed with disappointment. The mystery of the blue lights had a plausible explanation, albeit a mundane one. The story of that night would now be just another entry in the collection of horror stories told around campfires. It wasn't the supernatural encounter that many had speculated, but rather an example of how something ordinary could become extraordinary. In the right circumstances, the night had been unsettling, but in the end, it was a reminder of how our fears and imagination can sometimes amplify the unknown. And as I watched the troop leave Araca Mesa behind, I felt a mixture of closure and lingering curiosity. The blue lights were explained, but the night would forever remain a part of the collection of true scary stories that we all carry with us. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.